So I'm delighted this morning. First of all, I'm delighted to be honest with you. I was not anticipating that there would be many folks coming in this morning. I think all of us are all zoomed out. Every time I hear there's another meeting, it's like, oh my gosh, no, not one more. So it tells me, and it does my heart great, to feel that there are really educators and administrators that are seriously thinking about the needs of our English learners, and therefore they're eager to hear any updates and any information that would help them and their staff to really be able to meet the needs of these youngsters. So this is great news. So we're also going to ask that folks stay muted while Carrie, Parker, and Todd Grindal are presenting. But as a way to begin, for those that don't know, they are connected with the Regional Educational Lab, Northeast and Islands. And so it's 9 northeastern states and the territories of the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico. So today they're going to be using their applied research and actually an actual research project that they conducted in Connecticut to give some foundation for where they're going to spring from in terms of their presentation. And as most of you know, or many of you know, for me and for many states, the REL is an amazing, amazing partner. And one of my favorite plugs that I like to give to the REL is that if you go on the website for REL, you'll actually see a section where you can, it says Ask a REL, and you can pose a research question and magically some group of folks get right on it, and you get some great resources to really be able to delve into the answer for your question. So that's an amazing resource that they offer to us. With regard to Carrie, she is the Director of Applied Research for the REL, and in her work with the REL, she's been working with Connecticut and one of our districts in the state, educators, for almost 10 years. Most recently, she's been focusing on the intersection between English learners and disabilities, which those of you that are even remotely familiar with English learners, it is really, really challenging to be able to differentiate accurately whether a youngster is only in the early stages of learning English and therefore is struggling academically, or is something else going on. And most of us appropriately are reticent to refer them to the PPT evaluation process unless we feel really sure. But on the other hand, we don't want to wait too long because we could be losing valuable time where they could be getting support for both areas. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to, and you know what, Todd, either I didn't see it or I didn't get a quick one-liner as an introduction for your recent work. I know Carrie intimately, so maybe you can begin by just giving us a little background in terms of how you support the REL work.
Sure, thank you. Todd Grindal, I work with a research organization, SRI Education, and my work focuses on young children and children with disabilities. Most recently, working to understand how the child and school level factors that shape the identification and placement of students in special education programs. And so that's a lot of what I brought here to support Carrie in this work.
Terrific. Thank you.
Should I go ahead and start, Marie?
Yes, and I guess
Yes?
the other thing I wanted to mention is that after our session is over, first of all, it is being recorded, so it'll be available at a later date if you want to review it or to share it with your other wonderful colleagues where you're working. All right, Carrie, I think you're good to go.
Okay, great. Thanks, everybody. I'm going to share my screen. So hopefully at this point, you're now seeing the slide presentation. Is that right?
Yes, we are.
Heads. Okay, good. So that means that I can't see all of your faces. I just see a few different people. And I'm actually going to turn off my view because I hate looking at myself. There. Okay, there. So now I have no idea what I look like anymore. So, Todd and I are going to talk about the work that we did in Connecticut, as Marie described. And so I'm going to give most of the presentation, and then Todd is also available to answer questions. He participated in the interviews that we did in Connecticut and has been a key leader in helping figure out what our findings and implications are. So what I'm going to describe today is a project that we engaged in with educators in 4 different Connecticut districts. And we've, as Marie mentioned, we've been working with ELL educators in Connecticut for more than 10 years. And for the last 3, much of that work is focused on improving instructions for English learners who are struggling and who may have disabilities. And so this work was actually prompted by legislation in Connecticut that requires districts to report on the percentage of English learners identified with disabilities in comparison to the percentage of non-English learners with disabilities at the district level. And so they do a calculation to show whether districts have a higher percentage of English learners identified with disabilities or a lower percentage than non-English learners. And over a 3-year period, there was great variation across districts. And the Connecticut partnership asked RELNI to examine this issue and to try and better understand what was some of the variation that was happening and why some districts were identifying far more English learners with disabilities than others. So, and I think I was just talking about the project goals, and that one of them was to provide policies and practices that are used to identify disabilities among English learners in those 4 Connecticut districts, to describe the similarities and differences across the districts, and to provide technical support and training around those challenges and issues that were identified. So today I'm going to focus on the practices that we found and the technical support. Hopefully I'll share some of that with you, and hopefully you'll find it to be relevant and useful. Okay, so now, oops, there. Okay, so I've already introduced myself, Carrie Parker, and Todd. There were 2 other researchers who weren't able to be here today. Shayla Rodriguez is a research associate with RELNI, as well as Elisa Garcia. So our process, we interviewed, as you can see, we interviewed both teachers and administrators. We conducted in-person interviews in the spring of 2019 with district and building staff across the 4 Connecticut districts, focusing on educators in 3rd and 4th grades. So everything that we're going to talk about is really thinking about those 2 grades, which I think actually is important, and I'll get to that at the end. And so we looked at all the interview transcripts for patterns and themes and identified important areas as those where at least 3 people mentioned them in the interviews. And so just quickly, that among the administrators, we interviewed a wide range of administrators from school level principals and assistant principals, social workers, as well as district levels, directors of ESL programs, and superintendents and assistant superintendents. So I'm going to talk about the findings in 4 different areas: collaboration, cultural responsiveness, SRBI, and use of data and progress monitoring. I wrote it up here as multi-tiered systems of support, which is sort of broader than Connecticut, but I know that in Connecticut, it's SRBI. So I'm going to talk about each of these in turn. And please, if you do have a question or a comment, please feel free to use the chat or raise your hand if you can do that. I won't see everybody, but I'm fine with having this be more of a 2-way conversation rather than just me talking for what hopefully will be about 10 minutes, 10 or 15 minutes. So the first finding is collaboration. And I also want to say that while the specific findings emerged from the districts, they also align very closely with what we see in the research around evidence-based practices for each of these areas. So we found that teachers and administrators agree that successful collaboration is key to meeting student needs. And that's not a surprise to anybody, but one thing that is interesting to note is that administrators overwhelmingly talked about how important it is and how well they're doing it, how well their teachers are doing it, but they were not as articulate in identifying the specific challenges. And teachers were far more articulate in identifying what is it that prevents collaboration. And some of the things that they mention are that there is simply not enough time, particularly for ESL teachers. Oftentimes Formal planning times now include classroom teachers as well as interventionists and special educators, but ESL teachers sometimes are not able to be included in those formal collaborations. Then there's a lack of physical proximity. There's sort of a chance element that when teachers happen to be next to each other in a year, they collaborate a whole lot more than when they are across the building from each other, or when their schedules mean that they end up having free periods together just by coincidence. Another thing we noted is that collaboration tends to slow or stop after disability identification, and so there can be a disconnect between the whole SRBI and intervention process, and then if a student does get identified with a disability, what then happens, the experience that that student has after. So as I said, we're also going to be talking today about specific action ideas. We really tried to, rather than just talk about these sort of hypothetical bullet points, think about what is it that can be done specifically in schools to help promote these things that we're talking about. What you're seeing highlighted in italics and blue are the specific action ideas that we have pulled out from online resources that are talking about providing services to English learners in the remote learning context. And there is so much out there, as I'm sure you're aware. I'm sure you are flooded, as my email is, with webinars and this infographic and that piece of information. And so what we've tried to do here is pull out just a few points that can actually be relevant in an online context. One of them is to keep that priority on collaboration, maintain the existing formal collaborations and expand it, and make sure that those English learner specialists are communicating with the content area teachers, because the content area teachers are probably the ones that are spending more time with the English learners, and they really need to be hearing from the English learner specialist to know what to do. And so we've separated these into teachers and administrators, and I know most of you are administrators, so you're probably jumping down to that section there. So under the administrators, check in with teachers about their own needs, just to make sure that they have the resources they need to be able to collaborate. And then think about collaboration, not only between teachers, but also with parents. And I've actually, the parent shows up now in a couple of different of these categories, because this back and forth with parents is showing up over and over again as a really important mode of keeping kids connected in the remote learning context. And it really, there's actually a couple of recommendations that include having teachers have it be part of their workday that they spend at least 1 hour finding ways to have one-to-one communication with parents, whether through telephone or text or emails, but that be considered part of their instructional day, because keeping that connection and finding out what parents need to be able to help their kids be successful can go a long way to filling some of those gaps that we're seeing. So the second area is cultural responsiveness. And in those interviews, we found examples of cultural responsiveness across the board. We found some examples of deficit thinking as well, but many fewer. And it's really encouraging that so many teachers and administrators spontaneously identify the importance of being culturally responsive. Some of these topics that we talk about, we actually had interview questions where we asked them about this, but cultural responsiveness was not one of the interview questions, but consistently came up. And educators acknowledge that being culturally responsive is critical to their student success, but very few of them can articulate how to actually be culturally responsive. And so that's where there really is room for growth and for thinking about how we can help teachers understand what it means both for them individually, that they need to do some self-reflection, and how they can communicate that to their students and the families. Are people still hearing me okay? Yeah, okay.
Yes, I hear you fine.
Okay, all right, great.
Okay.
So, so then the action ideas around cultural responsiveness, this first one I feel like is really important. In all of the planning and instruction, keep marginalized students at the center. So what do we mean by this? So marginalized students are those students who tend to struggle. They're students with disabilities, they're English learners, they're the students that are on the edge. If we focus our planning and our instruction on those students, they will get the instruction that they need, as will all of the other students, because high quality instruction for an English learner or for a student with disability can also really provide high quality instruction for all students. Second is about, again, the communication with parents and families. And specifically around cultural responsiveness, being more willing to use the student's home language than perhaps happens typically in a classroom environment. And so this can include making sure that you have people who can communicate with families in their home language, that you use the Talking Points app has been coming up again and again, and there's actually a link in the slide presentation to that. It's an app where you type in English and say what language you want it translated to, and it shows up on the parent's phone in that language. And there's, I have not used it personally, but I've heard a lot of success in that. And also making sure that you have multiple modes of contact. Don't assume that when you send out an email, every parent is actually going to read it. And then the other big thing around cultural responsiveness is actually the first step, and I'm sure again you all have been working on this, is making sure that all students have access to sufficient and high quality technology and learn how to use it effectively. And I know that for many districts, this has really been the first step, and that you have to get this down before you can even move on to anything else. So thinking about SRBI. So again, it was really encouraging to see so many people across all 4 of the districts talking about SRBI and talking about how they use it with their students. Most of them talk about the critical need for Tier 1 instruction. And I want to emphasize this because Tier 1 instruction is 2 things. It's what's happening in the general education classroom. And so classroom teachers should be able to provide high quality Tier 1 instruction to English learners, classroom teachers just as much as ESL teachers. And also ESL services or bilingual services are Tier 1 instruction. They're not an extra intervention. They are the core instruction that English learners need. And so that seemed to be a fairly common understanding across the districts. And then there was a difference in the use of understanding how to move beyond that. There still are districts where people say you can't use SRBI with English learners until they reach a certain level of English, although that's not actually true. And there are other districts that adjust SRBI to the level of English of their students. So then in thinking about action ideas, this is, the biggest idea around SRBI is the idea of multiple modalities and being able to think about how English learners need multiple ways of accessing the curriculum. And particular when you're thinking about struggling English learners and all English learners, they really need work with the ability to participate in oral language activities as well as in written activities. They need to really practice that expressive language. And that's a real challenge in an online environment. How are you going to get English learners to be talking? And so focusing on that even more than you would focus in a regular classroom, in a physical classroom, can be helpful. One specific idea is actually providing small groups for English learners that focus on the specific high quality language interactions. So encouraging students to speak, and also setting up one-to-one, having 2 students speaking with each other. And because if there's only 2 students speaking to each other, both of them are going to have to speak a little bit, and then we'll get that oral language practice. And I'm seeing that some chats are coming up. I don't know if those are for me right now or not. So the final area is use of data and progress monitoring. Well, I'm just going to do a quick check on the chat here just to see.
I think it's mostly people's emails.
Okay, great, thanks. So the last area is the use of data and progress monitoring. This is very closely related to SRBI, because with SRBI, you use progress monitoring to move students through different interventions. But what we found particularly gratifying was to see how across our interviews, teachers and administrators described 21 different sources of data that they use. And these include conversations with parents, classroom observations, real peer comparisons. So when I say real peer comparisons, what I mean is that you have, if you're looking at a student who is in her 3rd year in the school system in learning English and who comes from a Spanish-speaking background, you want to find a similar student who is also in their 3rd year and also from a Spanish-speaking background, and that's where you can see whether or not the student is progressing at an acceptable, a developmental acceptable rate or not. You don't want to compare that English learner with a native English student and say, well, that student is behind because they're not doing as well as my native English student. So teachers are using multiple sources of data in order to be able to figure out what to do with students. And so then again, finally, the action ideas. This is a hard one for online, because how are you assessing? And in fact, I mean, it's going to be very interesting to see what happens in the next year, given that almost no states administer their state assessments to students at all. It will be very interesting to see if that feels like a loss, or if in fact it sort of feels like a gain because students didn't have to go through the high stress of all of those assessments. But you still do need to be doing formative assessments even in an online environment. And you need to be doing those assessments and then using the results as an opportunity for a conversation with students. So again, we come back to successful online learning is about that communication, that one-to-one communication with both the student and the parent to really be able to understand what's going on. And that obviously is more time consuming. It means less content gets communicated, et cetera. But more and more of the resources that are being put out there acknowledge that this is really a key, and that the actual content that's getting presented won't even be listened to if you're not thinking about these pieces. The second bullet there for teachers, and it goes for administrators as well, is the online sources for assessment tools, because there are definitely challenges with being able to find valid assessments for English learners who may have disabilities. Connecticut, the CIRC website has put together a great portal that you may already have seen, as well as the National Center on Intensive Intervention. So I encourage you to look at both of those. So this is, hopefully you'll have access to this. These are the links from which I got most of those recommendations. Some of these are REL resources. Across the RELs, there is now a group that's meeting weekly to strategize what are the key needs around providing stakeholders with useful resources for meeting the needs of all students, not just English learners. And so I've provided here some of the ones for English learners that are on the REL website, as well as a few non-REL sites as well. These action ideas for teachers and administrators are broken out in those previous slides, so I won't go over them here. And then I just wanted to finish by describing a little bit the second resource that Marie will be posting. And what this is excerpts from 3 webinars that RELNI administered in Connecticut in February of March of 2018. And it was really focused specifically on, as it says there, using data and progress monitoring in the tiered intervention framework. And what we did was we pulled out from those webinar slides 4 different sections that stand on their own and provide useful concrete strategies for teachers to use in these 4 areas. So first, the tools for understanding language versus disability. This is what teachers really want to know, and there are some specific tools out there, and this resource can help you identify and learn about those. And then the screening and progress monitoring, in addition to the suggestions that are on this presentation, there are more in there, as well as additional resources for identifying monitoring tools. And then the last section just helps to give an overview of the 3 tiers of response to intervention. And then I have one more slide for Connecticut in particular. Connecticut has a lot of resources, particularly around English learners and around English learners who may have disabilities. And in fact, the English Learners in Special Education Resource Handbook from 2011 is currently being updated. So that link is going to be out of date soon. I think they have a draft version that they're getting final review on. So there are resources throughout the state to really be able to help teachers and help administrators guide teachers to some of these tools. And the last one I'll mention is the second one in the bullet there about the professional learning online modules. That these are open source online modules that are asynchronous, that teachers can participate in, and they really are targeting classroom teachers. And so one of the things that we have found is that a lot of what we talk about are things that ESL teachers know. But there are things that classroom teachers really need to know, because when they're working with the student, with English learners day to day, they can feel like they just don't have any of the tools or skills but in fact, they can get those tools or skills pretty easily, and the resources are out there. So I'm going to pause now and see if there are any questions. And I think I'll actually stop sharing because this is a pretty boring slide. So.
Yeah, Carrie, I just wanted to say, you know, we had said we were really time limited, so I really appreciate, I can tell, because I've seen you present before, that it's, you're really doing it concise. So we really all appreciate it. We just have that limited amount of time. And I happen to notice in the chat that there are some folks that literally are squeezing it in, you know, but they only have 30 minutes and then they have to go to another meeting. Again, the famous Zoom conflict. So just to start, I wanted to thank you for moving so quickly, and the resources. Someone had asked if indeed we would have a copy of the PowerPoint, and I don't recall if you sent that to me.
I did, yes.
Oh,
that's
terrific.
One of the two resources.
Okay. All right.
And I'm putting the evaluation in the chat if people are willing to click on that. And it's a very short evaluation. It just helps us get a sense of how well we are meeting your needs, which is after all what RELMI is there for. We're federally funded in order to provide resources that are useful to all of you. So that's the evaluation helps us figure that out. But so Maria, if you have time, I'm glad to stay and answer questions. If you're moving on to something else, that's fine as well.
No, we don't have another presentation. It's more a matter of whether or not anyone, any of our participants had a specific question, either related to their own experiences or to their particular school. I know we have a lot of building principals, and some have pretty significant L populations within their school, and then there are others who have a small population, but once it's more than one or two, then it requires attention and support especially for the general ed teacher. So does anyone have any questions?
I guess I have a question, and you may have already said this and I missed it, but in terms of the origination of the research project, was that from the districts themselves trying to kind of get an assessment of how well they were doing, or can the findings be, you know, generalized beyond the 4 districts in some way?
Great questions, both of them. So the 4 districts were actually identified by, we put districts into 4 different categories. Either they had been identified, they had over-identified English learners in that legislation that I talked to you about, or they had not. And they were either high incidence English learners or low incidence English learners. And so we tried to pull districts in from each of those 4 categories. And so therefore, I would say that the findings are not generalizable in a research sense. This was very much a request to understand some of what was happening at the district level, and knowing that when you do interviews, you really can't generalize farther than that. But when we actually had originally proposed a quantitative study to the state, but because as the REL, you know, our primary desire is to be useful to our stakeholders, the Connecticut partnership, which had both district and state leaders on it, asked us to focus instead on this qualitative way of thinking about it, that while a quantitative study would be more generalizable, it wouldn't get at this process portion that they were most interested in.
Carrie,
if I might,
yeah, if I might add to that. So Bill, one of the interesting things here was we looked across those districts and said, are there things that are systematically different? High numbers of EL students, over-identified in terms of these practices. And we really didn't see it. We saw evidence of really good practices across the 4 districts, in some cases a little more deeply embedded than in others. But you know, we were looking to see, do we see better practices in those districts that have high numbers of EL students? And I don't think that was necessarily the case.
Yeah.
So kind of a
and I would
go ahead.
I was just going to add that I said early on that we focused on 3rd and 4th grade, and those district numbers about disproportionality are district-wide. And so it may well be that in 3rd and 4th grade, the practices, the teachers there have been focusing really hard on SRBI and on meeting the needs of English learners. And some of the over-identification may be happening at the high school level, or maybe in an area that we weren't actually talking about.
Mm-hmm.
I actually have a question. I wear 2 hats, special ed and ESL, as most of you know. And so as we, Todd, as we're getting ready for extended school year services and who is going to qualify and who isn't, for the most part, English learners are not often part of the ESY services. And it's simply a matter of that their disability may not, and their IEP goals and objectives just don't require mandated ESY. So thinking about either those Ls who are also identified as special ed, or just our Ls in general, particularly the ones that are still at a level 1 or 2 and just need a tremendous amount of support and can so readily lose if nothing is done, and they're only at home speaking their own language, especially now because we're not socializing, which is great for their language. We encourage that they, that families read to them, and because that's going to enrich them, but they'll lose that opportunity in some cases for any exposure to English. So I'm just wondering if the REL is either working on or thinking about, so what can administrators and or teachers recommend to families or to these students who are not going to be getting distance learning instruction and potentially aren't part of ESY, to get something to maintain their skills for the fall?
Yeah. So actually, across all of the RELs, there is a strategy that they're working on. The What Works Clearinghouse for years has been producing what they call practice guides, which are very concrete tools that are targeted to teachers for classroom strategies that they can use in multiple areas: mathematics, reading, and there's one for English learners. And so the RELs are now taking those practice guides and translating them into resources for parents. And so they are going to be, the ideal was they were going to be 2 pages of strategies and ideas for parents around these specific areas that come specifically out of the practice guides. So I'm participating in the development of the one for English learners, and hopefully it will be useful. But and one of the things that they say specifically in the English learner one is to continue to promote the home language. If you don't speak English, it is totally fine. And actually building your child's academic language skills in their own language is a really important building block for English. And so trying not to see that as, from a deficit perspective, but really from an assets perspective. And this tool that's being created, which hopefully will be out within a month, but RELs are sometimes slower than they want to be, will be in English, but we have really been pushing to say it needs to be available in Spanish as well. But as soon as these start coming out, you'll be getting emails about them in all the different subject areas.
Terrific.
Oh, yes, thank you. There's the practice guide. So.
Yes.
I just want to say, Carrie, that's fantastic. And I think that's something that a lot of our schools and teachers will really appreciate having. So I'm glad that you'll send us the emails when you get it. My question, and I always want to go cut to the chase as a former elementary school principal, what would be the 2 or 3 things that principals should know when they're supervising teachers in programs looking for those effective practices, or to help teachers use those effective practices? If you could say the 2, 3 things that we really should be doing, what would those be? And I know that's difficult, but from everything that you've done.
Todd, feel free to jump in.
Well, I might start with multiple sources of data and competence in using that data, because that is something that we saw did vary from setting to setting in some ways, and appeared to be driven by some school level value in doing that. There's, as Carrie talked about, when we want to understand the progress of English learner students, particularly in the early years, and to make these distinctions between, is this a language issue or is this an issue about some underlying disability, we need to go beyond just looking at their loss link scores. That other ways of being able to examine that data, the near peer sort of approach that Carrie talked about, that's something that we saw, that not every teacher had that kind of competence or support in being able to make those decisions, to talk about how those data work together with their colleagues and to make informed decisions about that particular student. So that might be one that I think is within the, within the power of the school principal to help inform and support teachers in doing that in a way that'll really support each individual student. Carrie?
So the one that I would say is to continue to build the culture that all educators are educators of English learners. And so that classroom teachers feel that they are valued for the skills that they're building to be able to work with English learners in their classrooms. And that ESL teachers are valued for all the expertise that they have. In fact, they can be teacher leaders in this particular area to really help build a school-wide expertise around the specific strategies for English learners. So that was the first one that came up to me, and partly that's because in this work with the REL, with the Connecticut English Learners Partnership, when we first met with them 3 years ago now and asked them to identify their priority goal, they determined that that was their goal, that across all education systems, educators would see themselves as educators of English learners, and that they're not those kids, they are our kids. So, yes, and Selena, absolutely the same for students with special needs as well.
Carrie, I put the practice guide from What Works Clearinghouse up on the link, and if they are great, those practice guides are great.
Well, and actually, I don't know if any of you participated. I don't know how many years ago it was now, but at REL, we sponsored a full day workshop in Hartford, Connecticut with 2 of the authors of that practice guide. And we had a plenary session and then some breakout sessions, and had more than 100 teachers come and participate in that. So these are, that guide is now 6 years old, and yet it still continues to be useful. Although I think also we want to make sure that we continue looking for the most updated resources, and so hopefully What Works Clearinghouse will come up with an updated one soon, because they seem to update them every 6 or 7 years. So the L resource guide is due for one.
Okay, I think we may be in good shape. We also use a little bit of our time if principals don't have to get back to everything else that's on their agenda, just to kind of network and to share what may be going on or in their schools, or what they're kind of worrying about over the next couple of days and weeks as schools are coming to a close. Some summer sessions are starting and some are not. And oh my, what's going to happen in September? But I just want to thank you, the 2 of you, so much. This was supposed to be live in person on April 30th. It was in my calendar. We were so excited. We were hoping everyone would come to CAS and would get a chance to see you in person and to network. And so this was our alternative. But I'm really hoping that once we get back to normal living, back to business, perhaps sometime either late fall or early spring, we can actually try this again, where we can really discuss more strategies. Many of our participants are typically principals. We also occasionally try to have them come in teams with, whether it's the special ed director or the ESL supervisor, and really work together to see what they can do to really continue to meet the needs of the ELs in their schools. So it's an exciting project, and I really appreciate the work that the REL has done, particularly to support ESL, and SEL and all the other wonderful things they do. So I thank the 2 of you.
Can I just
Thank
ask
you.
one?
Thank you for having us.
Can I just ask
All
one
right,
other question? Is that possible?
Sure,
Sorry.
of course.
Certainly.
No, not at all.
It just struck me. Did you either see any difference, or did it matter whether the district had more or less coordination of ELL services at the district level? Did you see any difference in districts, where they might have had, someone specifically tasked with the responsibility for ELL, or maybe in another district it was more decentralized? I'm just wondering whether how district support for ELL services might have, or maybe not, impacted the, what was happening at the school and classroom level.
Mm-hmm. So we didn't look for that specifically. I have a personal bias that yes, the more district coordination, the better. And oftentimes you see that English learner coordinators are not at the same level, say, as a special education director. And I think that can create a power dynamic that does not serve English learners well. I did find that in 2 districts in particular, in one where there was not a formal English learner director, but there was coordination across the district administrative staff. They had actually had working groups specifically looking at English learners who were struggling, and they had set up systems in the schools because they had that district level support. Mm-hmm. So I don't have hard evidence, but I have anecdotal evidence to support that. And Todd, I don't know if you have a quick reflection as well.
But from my own experience, I can actually say when I was working at the district level at a fairly large district with a pretty significantly large EL population, my position at that time was the director of special ed and special services, and ESL at that time, this is years ago, but nevertheless came under my jurisdiction. And at that time, my knowledge and experience with ESL was not that strong. So that's really tough if you don't have at least one person as the go-to to bring everything together amongst all of your schools. And in some of our districts, youngsters move from one school to another. And again, more important that you really need to have that kind of collaboration. Todd, you were going to say something?
So I'd add that with such a small number of districts, it is difficult to isolate, here is the reason that one may differ from another. I think we looked very closely to see whether the ideas and the approach articulated by the district administrators aligned with that from what we heard from teachers and principals. And in general, that was true, but not always. And I know in one case in particular, the person both in the superintendent and then the assistant superintendent who was in charge of EL instruction, they were fairly new. And so I think had not had the opportunity to articulate their vision and to see that in schools. But it was notable that there was kind of one idea for how we approach this at the district level and then another at schools. So I think a challenge. Who knows exactly why it was there? Again, not enough schools to be able to tell us, but it's that connection is not always there.
Thank you. Well, this was terrific. Thank you really very much, and I'm so happy to have you and look forward to having you back, whether in a virtual environment or in the real world, as Marie said. And but we appreciate your taking the time and certainly appreciate the research and the resource that the REL is for educators. So thanks so much.